to The Guilty Files, the podcast where every case gets a second look, a deeper dive, and two distinct takes that keep you coming back for more. I'm your host, Brian, and I'm here to bring you the unfiltered, no-nonsense breakdown of this week's crime. A little about me. I've spent 16 years in law enforcement, with 10 of those years pounding the pavement as a beat cop in the streets of Atlanta. I've seen crime up close, the chaos, the aftermath, and the cold, hard truths that never make the headlines. That's why my focus is simple. I'll take you through the facts of the case, step by step, with nothing left to speculation. But that's only half of what we do here. My co-host Danny is your guide to the other side of the story. He dives into the untold possibilities, uncovers hidden motives, and imagines the what-ifs that make you question everything you thought you knew. Together, we bring you two unique perspectives on every case. Because in true crime, the truth is rarely as simple as it seems. Every week, we promise you this: 2 cops, 1 crime, 2 stories told. If you're a fan of the details, the drama, and the darker side of human nature, you're in for a ride. So grab your headphones, lock the door, and let's get into The Guilty Files, where every case comes with a twist, and the truth is just the beginning. The first victim linked to the Atlanta child killer was 14-year-old Edward Smith. Born and raised in the East Lake Meadows housing projects in southwest Atlanta, Edward grew up without knowing his father and received little to no supervision from his mother. Despite this, he was an athletic boy who loved sports. To make money, he took on odd jobs around the neighborhood, often putting him in the company of shady characters. However, friends and family described Edward as a street-smart kid who made good decisions. His street smarts meant he was cautious, trusting very few people, and never getting into a car with someone he didn't know or trust. On the night of July 21, 1979, Edward had some extra money in his pocket and decided to take his girlfriend on a date to a local roller skating rink. They parted ways around 10 p.m., but Edward never made it home. His body was discovered a week later on July 28th in a wooded area. He had been shot in the back with a .22 caliber weapon. Similarly, Alfred Evans, a 13-year-old, was an athletic and street-smart boy who spent time hustling for money with little supervision from his parents. Alfred also grew up near East Lake Meadows and made money by taking odd jobs. Known for staying out late, Alfred's mother wasn't alarmed when he didn't return home on July 25, 1979. However, she reported him missing the next morning. The police, aware of Alfred as a runaway who associated with a rough crowd, dismissed his disappearance as temporary and assured his mother he would return. Tragically, Alfred's body was found near Edward Smith's on July 28th. He had been strangled to death. Investigators noted that the boys had gone missing on different nights and had different causes of death, dismissing the connection as a coincidence. Their bodies were found in a high crime area, and police assumed they were dumped there out of convenience rather than being linked. Shortly after, an anonymous tip suggested that both boys had been seen outside a known drug house, smoking marijuana days before their disappearances. Despite strong denials from their families, police believed the murders were drug-related, and the cases quickly went cold. The next victim was 14-year-old Milton Harvey, who disappeared on September 4, 1979. While running an errand to the bank for his mother. Despite his mother reporting his disappearance, Milton's case was not connected to the earlier murders. Police treated it as a typical runaway case until his badly decomposed body was discovered in a wooded area in November 1979. His cause of death could not be determined due to the advanced state of decomposition. The killer struck again on October 21, 1979. 9-year-old Yusuf Bell was last seen running an errand for a neighbor to buy snuff from a nearby store. Witnesses saw Yusuf at the store, where he purchased the snuff and some candy with the leftover change, but he never returned home. Unlike previous victims, Yusuf was not a known runaway or troublemaker. His mother, Camille, insisted that something terrible had happened and pressed the police to take the case seriously. Her worst fears were confirmed when Yusuf's body was found a month later in an abandoned school. He had been strangled. Devastated, Camille teamed up with other grieving mothers to form an organization aimed at drawing attention to the cases. Their group, STOP, focused on two goals: publicizing the deaths through media coverage and pressuring law enforcement to solve the murders. Camille's advocacy increased awareness of the cases, and suspicions grew that a serial killer was targeting Atlanta's black youth. By late 1979 and early 1980, the idea of a serial killer stalking Atlanta's children gained traction. However, law enforcement remained tight-lipped, and the media had yet to connect the cases. Despite this, a chilling pattern was emerging. The killer went silent for nearly 4 months after Yusuf's murder, but in March 1980, the terror resumed. 12-year-old Angel Lanier disappeared on March 4th while running errands for her family. Her body was found 6 days later in a wooded area, strangled with an electrical cord. She was believed to have been sexually assaulted, making her one of only 2 female victims linked to the case. A week later, 10-year-old Jeffrey Mathis disappeared while running an errand to buy cigarettes for his mother. His decomposed body was found a year later in a wooded area. The killer's next known victim was 14-year-old Eric Middlebrook, who disappeared on May 18, 1980, after receiving a phone call at home. His body was found the following day in an alley behind a bar. Eric had been beaten to death. Known for his size and street smarts, investigators speculated that Eric may have been ambushed or knew his killer. By now, investigators began piecing together patterns. Most victims were young black boys, abducted in broad daylight, strangled, and their bodies dumped in abandoned areas. Forensic techniques like fiber analysis began to play a role. Fibers found on Eric's shoes were carefully collected and sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation for testing. Amid growing public fear, theories about the killer's identity ranged from a local predator to a Ku Klux Klan conspiracy. Experts like Dr. Helen Morrison speculated that the killer was likely a black male, a theory that gained traction among law enforcement. As spring 1980 continued, the killer expanded their range. 12-year-old Chris Richardson disappeared on June 9th and was later found strangled. The next victim, 7-year-old LaTanya Wilson, was abducted from her home on June 23rd. Her skeletal remains were discovered a month later. The day after her disappearance, 10-year-old Aaron Weish was taken, his strangled body found under a train trestle. Facing mounting pressure, Atlanta police officially formed a task force on July 17, 1980. With 103 officers and FBI agents involved, the hunt for the killer intensified. Among the agents assigned to the case was the renowned FBI profiler Ray Hazelwood. Having worked on numerous kidnapping and serial murder cases, Hazelwood brought a fresh perspective and much-needed experience. He began his work by visiting the areas where many victims had disappeared, delving into the mind of the predator who was stalking Atlanta's children. After developing a profile of the killer, Hazelwood informed the task force that the perpetrator was most likely black. This assessment was supported by John Glover, the FBI chief in Atlanta at the time. As media attention grew, U.S. Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti announced on November 5, 1980, that the FBI was collaborating closely with state and local law enforcement. Civiletti also revealed that President Ronald Reagan was following the case closely. Despite the media attention, the formation of the task force, and even the president's involvement, the killings continued. On the steamy night of July 5, 1980, 9-year-old Anthony Carter disappeared while playing outside his home. After much pleading, his mother allowed him to join friends for a game of hide and seek. It was during this game, which stretched into the early morning hours, that Anthony vanished. Police were called, but it was too late. Anthony's body was found the next day. He had been brutally stabbed to death. The next victim was 11-year-old Earl Terrell, who disappeared on July 30, 1980. Earl had left home to go to the public swimming pool with friends. Known for his street smarts and tough demeanor, Earl was big for his age and no stranger to trouble. Shortly after arriving at the pool, he was kicked out for causing issues with other kids and making threats to a lifeguard. Earl told his friends he was going home, but he never arrived. Unusually, Earl's aunt reported receiving a call from a man claiming to have him. Police investigated the claim but came up empty-handed. Earl's body was later found in a wooded area, and like many others, he had been strangled. As the fall of 1980 approached, the task force seemed no closer to solving the case. Conspiracy theories swirled, with some speculating about a Ku Klux Klan connection, or even a government cover-up. While details of these theories were vague, they fueled public frustration. Atlanta's citizens were fed up. Many blamed poor police work, indifference, or outright corruption. In response, residents of Techwood Homes housing projects formed a vigilante group dubbed the Bat Patrol, named for the baseball bats they carried as they patrolled the streets. Other neighborhood watch groups emerged across the city, and children were rarely seen outside after dark. City officials implemented a citywide curfew in the fall of 1980, which was adopted by several nearby communities. The Atlanta City Council organized Saturday searches, focusing on wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and vacant lots in hopes of finding more victims or evidence. The first search led to the discovery of LaTanya Wilson's body. Despite these efforts, the killings continued. The killer even claimed an adult victim, 21-year-old Eddie Duncan, who disappeared on March 20th, 1981. His body was found in the Chattahoochee River on April 8th. It became apparent that the volunteers involved in the Saturday searches would find more bodies in the future as the killer's spree intensified. By January 1981, the murders had begun to significantly impact Atlanta's economy, dampening the usual New Year celebrations. The city welcomed the year with another tragedy. On January 3, 1981, 14-year-old Luby Jeter was last seen talking to a light-skinned black man with a scar on his face, wearing a baseball cap. Like many previous victims, Luby was a street-smart hustler, often seen selling car air fresheners. His body was found a month later, dumped in a wooded area alongside two other boys who had been missing for months. Witness accounts of the man Luby was last seen with led to a composite sketch, providing investigators with their first solid lead. However, with no suspects, all they could do was wait. On January 22nd, 15-year-old Terry Pugh, a friend of Luby's, disappeared. Terry, also street smart, often ran with the same crowd as Luby. When the task force learned of their connection, they suspected the boys had known their killer. Terry's body was found almost a month later, about 20 miles from his home. Scratches on his body suggested he had fought back. Investigators believe the distance from his home was a calculated move by the killer to throw off the investigation. By February 1981, the killings accelerated, with a body turning up nearly every week. Although the theory of Klan involvement seemed increasingly unlikely, it refused to disappear. Task force members focused on a small group of suspects but uncovered no evidence linking them to the murders. On March 2, 1981, 15-year-old Joseph Jojo Bale disappeared after stopping at a restaurant before meeting friends at a basketball court. After the game, Jojo was seen getting into a white station wagon with a light-skinned black man. Friends reported that the man's name was Wayne, and Jojo had willingly entered the car. This was a significant lead, but the task force was preoccupied investigating the Klan. While they now had a name, they had no suspect to link it to. 13-year-old Timothy Hill disappeared less than 2 weeks later, on March 13, 1981. Timothy and Jojo were friends and shared similar traits. Both hustled for cash and played basketball together. Witnesses reported that Timothy had grown cautious after Jojo's disappearance, but was not cautious enough. His niece saw him get into a taxicab, driven by a man who appeared suspicious. A witness, 34-year-old Frankie Mealing, came forward claiming that he had seen Timothy and other victims at the home of a convicted pedophile, Thomas Uncle Tom Terrell. Mealing alleged that as many as 10 victims had been at Terrell's house before their disappearances. Timothy's body was found later that day, stripped except for his underwear. He had been strangled. Investigators turned their focus to Terrell, who had a known history of sexual offenses. However, despite the alarming claims, Terrell and Mealing were eventually cleared as suspects. The task force continued their investigation as the killings showed no sign of stopping. With Jojo's disappearance, a new name surfaced in the investigation. As mentioned earlier, a witness stated that he saw Jojo get into a white station wagon. The witness specifically said, He got in the car, got in Wayne's car. The task force now had a name, Wayne, but nothing else to go on. The hunt continued, and so did the rising body count. As more children went missing, the tension in Atlanta reached a fever pitch. In early 1981, community members and the victims' families amplified their demands for answers, pressuring city leaders to take action. Long before the internet and social media, people relied heavily on local media for updates on cases like the one gripping Atlanta and its suburbs. As information slowly made its way to television stations, newspapers, and other print outlets, some of the most influential figures of the time took notice of the case. One such figure was Muhammad Ali, the legendary heavyweight boxing champion. Ali offered a $500,000 reward to the task force for information leading to an arrest. While the increased reward brought in tips, no arrests resulted from them. However, Ali's involvement elevated the case to the national stage, significantly raising public awareness. Other celebrities, including Burt Reynolds and Gladys Knight, contributed funds to support the task force's operations and assist the victims' families. Tragically, most of the victims' families never saw the donated money. The nonprofits managing the funds were understaffed and poorly organized. Serial killings of this nature were unprecedented, and there was no established framework for handling such donations. The logistics of distributing the funds proved overwhelming. Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra of the famed Rat Pack also stepped in, organizing a benefit concert to support the victims' families. Meanwhile, public pressure on authorities continued to mount. President Ronald Reagan acknowledged the Atlanta child murders and assigned Vice President George H.W. Bush to help coordinate efforts between local, state, and federal agencies. CNN, a relatively new network in 1981, was based in Atlanta and took a particular interest in the case. The network began covering the murders extensively, providing continuous updates. This 24-hour news coverage was groundbreaking, marking the birth of the modern news cycle. CNN's coverage prompted more established networks to follow suit, intensifying public pressure on the task force. The task force knew solving the case was crucial, but with few leads and no solid suspects, their strategy was to wait for the killer to make a mistake. They wouldn't have to wait long. On February 6, 1981, 11-year-old Patrick Baltazar went missing. Like many before him, Patrick was known for running errands and hustling for cash in his neighborhood. When his body was found in a wooded area, forensic investigators discovered dog hairs and carpet fibers on his body. These fibers matched evidence found on previous victims, revitalizing the task force and renewing hope that they were closing in on the killer. However, news of the fibers leaked to the media. Profilers had already suggested that the killer was intelligent and closely following press coverage of the case. They warned that he might change his tactics based on what he learned from the media, and that's precisely what happened. After the fiber evidence became public, every subsequent body attributed to the killer was dumped in a river rather than wooded areas. Jojo Bell's body was the first found near water. His nude, badly decomposed remains were discovered in April, just a few miles from where he had disappeared. This marked a significant shift in the killer's modus operandi. Another notable change was in the victimology. Patrick Baltazar was the last preteen murdered. After him, all victims were teenagers or young adults. Within a week, 3 adult males, Larry Rogers, Michael McIntosh, and Eddie Duncan, were killed and dumped in the river. Despite their growing understanding of the killer's methods, the task force struggled to stay ahead. In April 1981, after 2 more bodies were found in the Chattahoochee River, the task force turned to profilers Hazelwood and Detlinger for advice. The profilers suggested using the killer's new tactics against him. Since he now favored disposing of bodies in rivers, they recommended stationing officers at bridges and overpasses along the Chattahoochee River to catch him in the act. By May 1981, over 100 officers were involved in the operation. Despite efforts to keep the stakeout secret, details inevitably leaked. The task force continued to monitor bridges and previous dump sites while checking every lead, though most turned out to be false. By the end of May, it had been nearly a month since the killer's last victim, a significant slowdown compared to his previous weekly pace. Investigators speculated that he might have moved, been arrested for an unrelated crime, or even died. But just as the task force prepared to scale back its efforts, the killer made a critical mistake over Memorial Day weekend. On the night of May 21, 1981, Bob Campbell, a rookie Atlanta police officer, was stationed at a bridge over the Chattahoochee River. Around 2:30 a.m., he heard a splash and saw a car's brake lights as it moved away from the bridge. Campbell radioed for backup, and officers stopped the vehicle, a white station wagon nearby. The driver was a young, light-skinned black man named Wayne Williams. His demeanor was nervous and agitated, and he reportedly said, "I know this is about those boys." Williams claimed he had been checking on a client, Cheryl Johnson, but police later discovered that the name and address he provided were fictitious. Officers also noted that Williams bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch based on witness descriptions from the Luby Geter case. Although Williams allowed a search of his car, the only item of interest was a length of nylon cord, which the officers inexplicably did not retain. With no evidence to link Williams to the murders, the police had no choice but to let him go. 3 days later, the partially decomposed body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Carter was found near the bridge where Williams had been stopped. The coroner determined that Carter had likely been strangled, and while there was no physical evidence of sexual assault, investigators suspected a sexual motivation due to the removal of Carter's clothing. Theories abounded about the killer's reasons for leaving victims nude. Some believed it was part of a sexual ritual, while others argued it was a calculated attempt to prevent police from collecting trace evidence, such as fibers or hairs. Investigators noted that the fibers and dog hairs found on earlier victims had not reappeared on later bodies. Despite his age, Carter was added to the list of victims linked to the Atlanta child murders. His death marked the final case attributed to the killer, a chilling chapter in a spree that had terrorized Atlanta. Nathaniel Carter, the latest victim, was known to engage in sexual activity with men for both pleasure and money. A convicted felon, Carter had a history of petty crimes and lived most of his life on the fringes of society. His slight build led investigators to believe that he could have been easily overpowered by Wayne Williams. When Carter's remains were found on the riverbank, the task force became increasingly confident that Wayne Williams was their killer. Most investigators agreed that while Williams might not have been responsible for all 28 victims, he was likely connected to the majority. However, knowing and proving were two entirely different matters. Despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, convicting Williams required much more. He had been stopped on a bridge after a police recruit heard a loud splash. His behavior during questioning was suspicious, and none of the information he provided checked out. Days later, a body was found just a short distance from where Williams had been stopped. With these facts in hand, Wayne Williams became the prime suspect. With the circumstantial evidence growing, investigators intensified their focus on Williams. They began by reviewing their compiled list of suspects to see if his name had already surfaced. It hadn't. This led them to conduct an exhaustive background check, reaching out to former classmates, friends, and business associates. A pattern began to emerge, revealing the real Wayne Williams. Those who knew Williams described him as smart, ambitious, helpful, and conscientious, qualities that made him generally likable. However, he was also a loner, not known for being overly sociable or for dating men or women. None of this surprised investigators, as it aligned with the profiler's predictions about the child killer. Wayne Bertram Williams was born in 1958 in a partially segregated Georgia. He grew up in the Dixie Hills neighborhood of southwest Atlanta, which would later become home to many of his alleged victims. During his childhood, Dixie Hills was a vibrant area with Black-owned businesses deeply rooted in the community. By the 1960s, however, the construction of large housing projects brought significant socioeconomic shifts to the area. In the 1970s, as white flight occurred, many middle and upper-income Black families also began moving to the suburbs, particularly in DeKalb County, east of Atlanta. This exodus left neighborhoods like Dixie Hills economically vulnerable, with rising poverty and crime rates. Despite these challenges, the Williams family chose to stay. Their home was paid off, and while crime increased, they still felt relatively safe and decided to make the best of their situation. By all accounts, Wayne's childhood was uneventful. His parents, Homer and Faye Williams, were both school teachers. They maintained a stable household with no history of drug use, minimal alcohol consumption, and no evidence of abuse. As their only child, Wayne was doted on and given nearly everything he wanted. His parents also prioritized education, encouraging his academic success. Wayne excelled in school, particularly in math and music, and consistently earned high grades. Teachers described him as quiet, intelligent, and respectful. He scored above average on IQ tests and graduated at the top of his class from Frederick Douglass High School, where he was elected student council president. Despite receiving numerous scholarship offers, he chose to forego college, instead taking a few business classes at Georgia State University before abandoning higher education altogether. Music was Wayne's one true passion. Although he lacked any musical talent himself, he aspired to be a talent agent, inspired by the success of the Jackson 5. Wayne had a knack for electronics, which earned him odd jobs fixing equipment for friends and family. This expertise led to positions at several local radio stations, where he learned the technical side of broadcasting. With financial support from his parents, Wayne started his own radio station at home. By 1976, he decided to combine his experience in music and electronics to launch a career as a talent scout. Using his smooth-talking personality, he established contacts in Atlanta's music scene, some legitimate and some imagined. He convinced young locals that he was a legitimate talent agent. His primary focus was on boys, a choice he claimed was inspired by the success of the Jackson 5. Wayne auditioned boys for a band he called Gemini, often in his home studio or at local recording studios where he had connections. Despite his growing reputation in Atlanta's music scene, most people were unimpressed by his efforts. Many recalled that he appeared to be auditioning boys for a band that didn't exist, and his lack of musical talent undermined his credibility. Ultimately, his ventures drove his parents into bankruptcy. Despite these setbacks, Wayne persisted. He distributed flyers advertising Gemini in the very neighborhoods where many boys would later disappear. In addition to his music aspirations, Wayne worked as a freelance photographer, often driving around at night with a police scanner. He would rush to crime scenes, take photos, and sell them to local newspapers. He also used a video camera, rare at the time, to sell footage to news outlets. This work gave Wayne access to Atlanta's streets, alleys, vacant lots, and bridges, where he could blend into the city's nightlife. His frequent presence at crime scenes was easily explained by his photography job, allowing him to avoid suspicion. Wayne's outward persona was that of an intelligent, charismatic, and likable individual. Yet underneath, he was someone who would say anything to impress others. He falsely claimed affiliations with groups such as the National Honor Society and Junior ROTC. His lie about the ROTC extended further in 1976, when he was arrested for impersonating a police officer. Though the charges were dropped, he kept a replica police uniform and flashlight in his car. Some investigators theorized that Williams used his police impersonation skills to lure unsuspecting children. His ability to fabricate elaborate lies extended to claims of being a Top Gun fighter pilot and a CIA operative. While his motivations for these tall tales remain unclear, one thing was certain. Wayne Williams had no qualms about looking someone in the eye and lying. Armed with newly gathered facts about their prime suspect, the task force intensified their efforts to build a solid case against Wayne Williams. They were confident he had murdered Nathaniel Carter and believed he was responsible for most, if not all, of the other victims connected to the Atlanta child murders. However, they still lacked sufficient evidence to obtain a search warrant for his car or home. The profilers working with the task force suggested they could use Williams's ego to their advantage. Acting on this advice, investigators contacted Williams and invited him in for what they described as a routine interview. He agreed, and after several hours of questioning, investigators pressed him on the murders. Williams, however, refused to admit any involvement. To further probe his potential guilt, they asked if he would take a polygraph test. He agreed and promptly failed. Despite the results, Williams denied any connection to the murders. Investigators offered him 2 additional opportunities to take the test. Both times he agreed and failed again. The polygraph examiner, convinced of Williams's guilt, reportedly told him, "I'll be darned. You're the guy we've been looking for 2 years." Although polygraph results are not admissible in court, the failed test strengthened the task force's conviction that Williams was their man. This marked a turning point in the investigation, but Williams was not about to sit idly by. Although the task force had not officially named him as a suspect, news of his questioning spread quickly through his neighborhood. Residents began paying close attention to the Williams home and noticed unusual activity in the days following his stop on the bridge. Witnesses reported seeing Wayne and his father, Homer Williams, intensively cleaning the house and yard. The white station wagon was cleaned out for hours, and the two men were seen carrying boxes from the house to their car and leaving for extended periods. Neighbors also reported seeing them burning unknown materials in their backyard barbecue grill, noting that the smell was not that of burning charcoal. There was also a noticeable shift in the demeanor of the Williams family. Normally cordial, Wayne and his father became curt and avoided casual interactions with neighbors, focusing solely on their cleanup efforts. When the task force learned that possible evidence was being destroyed, they moved quickly to secure a search warrant. A judge approved the request, and investigators searched the Williams home and vehicles. They focused on carpets, rugs, and upholstery, and collected hair samples from the family's German Shepherd. As public interest in the case grew, the media clamored for updates. Atlanta Public Safety Director Lee Brown held a press conference to address the investigation. In a somewhat contradictory statement, Brown said, "It has consistently been our position, based on the evidence, that we do not have a single person involved in all the cases of the missing and murdered children. That is our position today." Despite this acknowledgement of the possibility of multiple perpetrators, the task force remained focused on building their case against Williams. While DNA analysis was still years away, investigators utilized other forensic techniques available in 1981 to link Williams to the murders. Blood samples from his car, as well as fibers and dog hairs, collected during the search of his home and vehicles, provided a crucial connection to several victims. During a marathon interrogation on June 3, 1981, Williams struggled to provide credible alibis for the murders. He consistently claimed he had been working as a freelance photographer or scouting talent in areas where children disappeared. However, he failed to name anyone who could corroborate his whereabouts during the times in question. Further scrutiny revealed Williams's connections to several victims. For example, he used the mailing address of a seafood restaurant where JoJo Bell was known to spend time. Williams was also acquainted with JoJo's friends and closely resembled the composite sketch created from a witness's description. He was similarly linked to 22-year-old Larry Rogers, whose mother reported that Williams once hid her younger son from the police and took him to the hospital after a fight. Despite the strong circumstantial evidence, physical evidence ultimately played a pivotal role. Fibers found on Eric Middlebrook's body matched a distinctive trilobal fiber from a rug in the Williams home. Larry Peterson, who analyzed the fibers, described them as highly unique. With assistance from FBI microanalyst Hal Dedman, investigators traced the fibers to their original manufacturer. In a bizarre turn of events, the day after the search warrant was executed, Wayne Williams held a press conference at his home at 7 a.m. He insisted on several conditions. His face would not appear on camera, and his name would not be mentioned. Surprisingly, the press agreed to these terms, adding to the unusual nature of the event. During the press conference, Williams was asked about the victims. His response was unsettling, saying, quote, "Some of these kids in places they don't have no business being, at certain times of the day and night. Some of them don't have no kind of home supervision, and they're just running around in the streets wild. And I'm saying when you're doing that, that's not giving anyone license to kill, but you're opening up yourself for all kinds of things." End quote. Reporters were visibly disturbed by his remarks, but continued their questioning. Williams shifted focus to the task force, portraying himself as a victim of their desperation to close the case. He claimed that an officer on the task force had pointed at him and said, "I'm tired of all the BS, working long hours and stakeouts. I'm ready to put the thing to an end." Williams concluded the press conference by demanding an apology from the FBI or anyone responsible for leaking information to the media. His performance did little to improve public perception and only fueled suspicions against him. That apology would never come. Although the press agreed not to show Wayne Williams' face or use his name during the press conference, those restrictions apparently ended once the event was over. Soon after, Wayne Williams' name, home address, and several photos of him were broadcast by media outlets around the world. He was publicly named as the prime suspect in the Atlanta child murders. The Williams family home quickly became ground zero for a relentless media circus. The task force remained nearby, not because they viewed Williams as a flight risk, but out of concern that a family member of one of the victims might attempt vigilante justice. They also feared that Williams or his father might lash out at the persistent press and gawkers surrounding their home. Most worrisome of all, the task force suspected Williams might be brazen enough to take another victim under their watchful eye. To mitigate these risks, the task force covertly placed a LoJack-style tracking device on Williams' car. In 1981, this was cutting-edge technology, albeit limited in range, as the receiver needed to be relatively close to the vehicle to function. Nevertheless, it allowed the task force to monitor Williams' movements during his frequent, unannounced outings. This tense game of cat and mouse lasted for 17 days following Williams' impromptu press conference. The constant surveillance and media attention began to take a toll on Williams and his family. He and his father frequently emerged from their home to confront reporters, removing them from their lawn and threatening lawsuits against both the press and the task force for harassment. Williams also began leaving his house late at night to drive aimlessly around the city. On one occasion, he stopped in front of the mayor's residence and caused a scene. He also engaged in high-speed chases with members of the task force, clearly testing their patience. Despite the frustrations on both sides, investigators worked diligently with the district attorney's office to build an airtight case. They understood they would only have one chance to convict Williams and wanted it to be bulletproof. Once the Fulton County District Attorney decided to move forward with first-degree murder charges against Williams, the task force carefully planned his arrest. In the early hours of June 21, 1981, investigators descended on the Williams home and arrested him without incident. Williams was arraigned in Fulton County, denied bail, and remained in custody until his trial began nearly 6 months later, on January 6, 1982. By modern standards, 6 months is a relatively short time frame for a double first-degree murder case to progress to trial. Many attributed this to Williams' legal team's lack of experience with such cases. They filed few pretrial motions and raised minimal objections during hearings. With limited financial resources, they could not afford expert witnesses, leaving them with few strategies to delay the trial. Surprisingly, Williams' attorneys did not seek a change of venue, a common request in high-profile cases where pretrial publicity might bias the jury pool. Instead, they argued that their client could receive a fair trial in Fulton County. They believed a predominantly black jury in Atlanta would be more favorable than a jury from a rural, less racially diverse area. The prosecution was keenly aware of the racial tensions surrounding the case, particularly the early conspiracy theories about Ku Klux Klan involvement. They were determined to avoid any appearance of bias during jury selection. Ultimately, the jury consisted of 8 black and 4 white members, 9 women and 3 men. Given the high-profile nature of the case, the jury was sequestered, with restricted media access, for the trial's duration, which lasted 8 weeks. Fulton County officials announced that the trial judge would be selected randomly by a computer program. However, when Judge Clarence Cooper was chosen, some questioned whether the selection was truly random. A respected figure, Cooper was the first black judge elected to the Fulton County bench. His presence reassured many that the trial would not be racially biased. However, critics pointed out Cooper's past as a prosecutor who had worked with District Attorney Jack Slayton, raising concerns about impartiality. The prosecution kept most of its evidence under wraps before the trial, choosing to present their case in court rather than the court of public opinion. While the media speculated about the carpet fiber evidence, there was much more to the case. Prosecutors focused on physical and circumstantial evidence, which they believed would secure a conviction. The prosecution consulted criminal profilers to establish a potential motive, though it wasn't legally required. Profilers analyzed victimology. All the victims were black, most were male, and all were under 30. They theorized that Williams harbored animosity toward his own race, based on past statements and the act of manual strangulation, the cause of death in most cases. They also speculated about a sexual component to the murders, noting that many victims were found nude before the killer began disposing of bodies in water. Based on these profiles, the prosecution argued that Williams' motivation stemmed from self-hatred and repressed homosexuality. However, they knew the case would hinge on the physical evidence, not motive. Although Williams was only charged with 2 murders, evidence from other cases was admitted at trial. Prosecutors presented forensic findings showing that 19 different carpet fibers from Williams' home and car matched fibers found on 12 victims. Larry Peterson, who led the fiber analysis, explained in plain terms that the fibers were a unique yellow-green color, manufactured in Dalton, Georgia, between 1967 and 1974. The odds of similar fibers being present in another Atlanta home were 1 in 7,792. In addition to the carpet fibers, blood and hair evidence tied Williams to multiple victims. Blood samples found in his white station wagon matched the blood types of several victims. Human hair consistent with Williams' own was found on Patrick Baltazar's shirt, and dog hair from a German Shepherd, the same breed owned by the Williams family, was found on Nathaniel Cater's body. The circumstantial evidence was equally damning. Witnesses testified that Williams was seen with several victims before their disappearances. Eugene Lester, a friend of JoJo Bell, identified Williams as the man driving the white station wagon JoJo entered before he vanished. Additional witnesses testified that Williams was homosexual with pedophilic tendencies. One key witness, Robert Henry, was a small-time hustler with a criminal record. Despite his past, Henry came across as credible to many in the courtroom. Robert Henry testified that he saw Wayne Williams with Nathaniel Cater the night Cater disappeared. He stated, "They were holding hands, you know, like a male and female. If you're holding hands with one of my coworkers and both of you are male, what am I supposed to do? Turn my head?" Henry didn't turn his head that night, and he testified that Williams was the man he saw walking hand in hand with Nathaniel. Williams' attorneys attempted to discredit Henry during cross-examination. Despite Henry's lack of formal education and less than polished speech, he never wavered and stuck to his story. The jury found Henry to be a credible witness, and it was clear his testimony carried weight. Nathaniel Cater was known to be bisexual and often engaged in prostitution for extra money. Employees of a popular gay bar, the Silver Dollar, testified that Cater was a regular and that Wayne Williams had been seen there on multiple occasions. This placed Williams in proximity to yet another victim. The mountain of physical and circumstantial evidence presented in the case posed a significant challenge for Williams' defense team. This was further compounded when the presiding judge allowed the prosecution to introduce evidence from 10 additional crime scenes believed to be linked to Williams. These cases became known as the pattern murders and were controversial even at the time. The inclusion of the pattern murders as evidence was not unusual, as prosecutors often seek to establish a pattern of behavior in serial murder cases. Much of the fiber evidence presented by the prosecution originated from these cases rather than the 2 murders Williams was officially charged with. The pattern murders included some of the earliest victims, such as Alfred Evans and Eric Middlebrooks. Carpet fibers found on Middlebrooks' shoes were the first pieces of physical evidence collected in the case. Other pattern murder cases included Charles Stevens, 12, disappeared on October 9, 1980 and was found suffocated. Terry Pugh, 15, disappeared on January 26, 1981 and was found strangled. John Porter, 18, found stabbed to death in April 1981. JoJo Bell, Luby Jeter, and Patrick Baltazar, victims whose cases were tied to fibers and circumstantial evidence. Larry Rogers, 21, and William Barrett, 17, found strangled in May 1981. The prosecution argued that Williams' connections to the victims, combined with the physical evidence, established a clear pattern. The majority of victims were young black males under the age of 28, with an average height of less than 5 feet 6 inches and weighing under 150 pounds. Most of the victims were found nude, leading investigators to believe the removal of clothing was a deliberate act to eliminate evidence, though it may have also represented a form of sexual dominance. While some theorized that the killer engaged in sexual activity with or near the bodies, no direct evidence supported this. The victim's vulnerability was a key factor in the killer's modus operandi. Most of the younger victims spent significant time on the streets hustling for money, while the adult victims were often involved in prostitution. None of the victims had access to a vehicle, making them easy targets. The killer typically lured victims by offering rides, murdered them in one location, and dumped their bodies in another, usually wooded areas, vacant lots, or near water. Prosecutors explained deviations in the killer's behavior, such as the later victims' older ages, by pointing to increased media attention. As fear spread, children and their parents became more cautious, leaving fewer young boys on the streets. This forced the killer to target older victims who were more accessible. The dumping of bodies in or near water also demonstrated increased sophistication, as the killer likely sought to destroy evidence. Prosecutors argued that Williams's familiarity with Atlanta's layout, its neighborhoods, vacant lots, and waterways, enabled him to carry out these crimes undetected. With a limited budget, Williams' defense team relied on court-appointed attorneys. The team was led by Mary Welcome, a former city solicitor with trial experience but no background in murder cases. She was assisted by Tony Axum, who brought stability to the team with his experience handling major crimes. However, shortly before the trial, Williams replaced Axum with Alvin Bender, an aggressive trial attorney known for his confrontational cross-examinations. The defense strategy was to cast doubt on the physical and circumstantial evidence, emphasizing that none of it was 100% conclusive. They questioned the credibility of eyewitnesses, portraying Williams as a victim of misidentification and bad luck. Despite calling a few witnesses and presenting alibis, the defense offered little to counter the prosecution's case. Against the advice of many, Williams chose to testify in his own defense. Initially, he came across as shy and timid, speaking softly and politely. However, by the third day of his testimony, his demeanor changed dramatically. Frustrated by the prosecution's pointed questions, Williams became confrontational, shouting, "Do you want the real Wayne Williams? You got him." He even referred to the prosecutor as a drop shot, a term witnesses had previously testified Williams used to describe his victims. Williams' emotional outbursts painted him as volatile, undermining his earlier composed demeanor. His time on the stand ultimately hurt his case, leaving the jury with the impression that he was capable of violence. After 8 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 11 hours. On February 27, 1982, Wayne Williams was found guilty of the murders of Nathaniel Cater and Jimmy Ray Payne. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in the Georgia Department of Corrections. Although convicted of 2 murders, Williams is believed to have killed at least 28 victims between 1979 and 1981. Despite the verdict, questions remain about his involvement in all the murders. Conspiracy theories such as Ku Klux Klan involvement and pedophile rings have persisted over the years, though none have been substantiated. Williams continues to profess his innocence, and his efforts to appeal his convictions have so far been unsuccessful. His next parole hearing is scheduled for November 2027. That brings us to the end of this week's case file. A huge thanks to you, our listeners, for tuning in and making this all possible. Your curiosity, intrigue, and passion for true crime creates the space for us to tell these stories. When you listen, share, and engage with our content, you're the heartbeat of this show. So keep that guilty pleasure alive. Tell your friends, post about the show, and let us know your thoughts. We love hearing from you. Reach out to me anytime via email at Brian, BRIAN, at paranormalworldproductions.com. And don't forget, this episode was brought to you by the talented team at Paranormal World Productions Studio. Their commitment to professional and high-quality storytelling is what makes the Guilty Files possible. Visit www.paranormalworldproductions.com to learn more about the show, the studio, and everything we're working on behind the scenes. We'll be back next week with more true crime, revisited and reimagined. You don't want to miss the next chapter of our storytelling journey. As always, keep exploring justice through fact and fiction. Thanks for listening to The Guilty Files, and until next time, stay suspicious, keep it guilty. Just be sure to keep your alibis airtight, and maybe delete your browser history.